Hello, my name is Brad Ladwig and welcome to this poster presentation for the AIChE annual meeting. Our topic today is photoresponsive materials and their use in mixed matrix membranes for CO2 separation from nitrogen. The topic itself, the importance is obvious. There is an enormous demand for new technologies for CO2 separation, and that is clear because we know that CO2 emissions are contributing to climate change, to catastrophic climate change in fact, and that it will become ever more important that we develop new technologies for energy conversion, for energy utilization that basically don't have such significant or ideally no greenhouse gas emissions. Many technologies will be required to get us to this new future, and one of them will be CO2 separations, and in particular separations of CO2 from post-combustion gas mixtures. And in these particular separations, the key molecular separation is the separation of CO2 from nitrogen. This is a fairly challenging separation, and while we study it in the lab, we often use synthetic mixtures of CO2 and nitrogen, often with a proportion of 85% nitrogen and 15% CO2, because this roughly corresponds to the flue gas composition that you get when a carbonaceous material is combusted in air. So we study it often with those synthetic gas mixtures, but of course for real systems you need to also consider the other components that are present in flue gas mixtures. Now, we are not interested in just making static membranes that give us an excellent performance over a long period of time. And industrially, these are probably the membranes that will most likely see application, especially at larger scale. But from a scientific perspective, we're very interested to see if we can make switchable membranes or smart membranes that can change their properties depending on an external stimulus. And this talk today looks in particular at membranes and materials that are photoresponsive materials. So in the literature, there are various different examples of external stimuli that can be applied to materials, and in particular we're looking at porous materials, to change their gas sorption characteristics or their gas transport characteristics, especially when those porous materials are being used in membranes. Some of those stimuli, including an external magnetic field, external temperature changes, pH changes, but the stimulus that we have been working with quite extensively and for some years now is photoresponsive materials. So this is applying light to the material to trigger a change in the material, ideally a change that is temporary, that only applies while the light is applied, and that change, for example a structural change, will induce a change in the sorption or transport characteristics of that material. And the particular one, because CO2 is such an important molecule of interest, is that we've studied extensively is the CO2 sorption characteristics. The experiments that you need to do to study these materials are a little bit complex. So while it is fairly straightforward to measure the CO2 uptake of a material using conventional gas sorption apparatus, to do it with the presence of light requires some careful modifications. And what that means is that we need to be able to bring light into the material. We need to be able to illuminate the material, and ideally illuminate all of the material, so we don't want to have a large amount of sample where it's difficult to illuminate materials, particles in the middle of the sample. And what's very important, and we found this quite early on, is that you need to very carefully control the temperature of the sample. So obviously when we use light to illuminate a material, that material will absorb some of that light. And that absorbed energy, some of it in the materials that we are working with, goes into inducing a conformational or a structural change in part of the material, but some of it will literally just be absorbed and used to increase the temperature of the material. And when we make our studies, it's very important to try and differentiate between changes in the adsorption characteristics that result from a change in the structure of the material and changes in the adsorption characteristics or transport characteristics that result from a change in the temperature of the material. Because when we study materials with physisorption, the local temperature is very, very critical. A small change in the local temperature can actually result in quite a large change in the amount of molecules adsorbed. So that's something that we take great care with, and you can look at some of the reference materials provided to see how we deal with that. So an exciting recent result that we've published is the synthesis of Azo-Uio-66. So this is a photoresponsive metal organic framework material that that's based on UIO-66. UIO-66 is very, very well-known MOF material, relatively straightforward to synthesize, and has very good stability. And so the reason we're very interested to work with this is that if we can modify UIO-66 to induce a photoresponsive nature to it, we have a material that's photoresponsive and useful for us, but it has the excellent characteristics of stability that we get from UIO-66. The way that this has been done is to take the conventional ligand in UIO-66, which is terephthalic acid, and modify it to incorporate a pendant side group with this azobenzene functionality. So the nitrogen-nitrogen double bond is a photoisomerizable bond that it can absorb UV and to a certain extent visible light and photoisomerize between the cis and trans conformations. And by doing that, we produce a material that has a pendant group that protrudes into the pores of the UIO-66 and that can change its conformation between a more open and a more closed conformation that either promotes or the absorption of CO2 or promotes the desorption of CO2. And you'll see that in some of our characterization results. One very interesting aspect of this study is that we were able to substitute a varying degree of the terephthalic ligands with this azobenzene modified ligand. And what that allowed us to do is to see if you only substitute a small proportion of the ligands, do you only see a small change in the properties? Or basically to determine how much of the change in the properties is due to the ligand substitution. And we think that's quite an elegant aspect of this work. What we're showing here are some results from materials characterization on Azo-Uio-66. So down the left side, what you see are a range of crystal structures. Now, these are hypothetical structures. These have been created using Crystal Maker software, and they correspond. What we're showing here are some results from materials characterization on Azo-Uio-66. So down the left side, what you see are a range of crystal structures. Now, these are hypothetical structures. These have been created using Crystal Maker software, and they correspond to the theoretical amount of ligand substitution that has occurred, and we've assumed that that substitution has occurred evenly throughout the crystal or the bulk material. So these are not from resolved crystal, single crystal or powder structures. Then what you see in the top graph is the changes that we observe in powder X-ray diffraction for these materials as you increase, so going from the top, which is pure UIO-66, to the bottom, which is Azo-100. So 100% of the terephthalic acid has been substituted with the modified ligand, Azo-100 UIO-66. And what we see is that the most significant peaks are retained. So the overall topology remains that of UIO-66, but there is some peak broadening. And basically, as you will see from the other results that we're presenting, which shows that as you load more and more of these pendant groups in, you disrupt the packing of the UIO-66, the neat crystal structure. And so there is some broadening, so there is some lessening of the crystallinity of the material, but the base topology is retained. Underneath that, what you see is the gas sorption isotherms. These are nitrogen sorption isotherms at 77 Kelvin, and what's plotted on the y-axis is the quantity absorbed as a function of the reduced pressure, and that shows us that the shape of the isotherm is retained. So again, we believe that we maintain the pore structure and the pore size, but we greatly reduce the pore volume. And that's simply because we have so many of these pendant side groups protruding into the pores. This is a really key result. This shows the static and dynamic photoresponsive sorption studies for Azo-Uio-66 at 273 Kelvin, so 0 degrees Celsius, and 298 Kelvin. So what you see on these graphs is at the top, you see a red curve. This is the static sorption isotherm for CO2 with no UV light, no light whatsoever. Then at the somewhat lower than that, you see a blue curve. This is the static sorption isotherm with full illumination. So basically from the start of the experiment to the end of the experiment, the material is constantly illuminated with UV light, 365 nanometer UV light. So those two curves themselves show you that this is a photoresponsive material, that the ability of the material to absorb CO2 when it's irradiated with UV light is substantially reduced. But the really exciting result is the dynamic photoresponsive sorption study. So in this case, as the sorption isotherm has been collected, we have switched the light on and off. And what you see very, very clearly is that the material switches between these two extreme conditions, between no UV illumination, the upper curve, and full UV illumination, the lower curve. And that is a really critical result. That shows us that this material can rapidly and completely reversibly change its structure, its ability to sorb CO2. So that's a very exciting result. The other key takeaway message from this graph is that at 298 Kelvin, the total quantity absorbed under all three situations, no light, full light, and switching light, is decreased compared to at 273 Kelvin. And that's an understandable and expected result in physisorption, which is that as you increase the temperature, basically the adsorbate, the molecules absorbing on the surface, have more energy, and so their ability to form an adsorbed monolayer on the surface of the pores is decreased, the probability that they will adsorb there. As I said earlier, in this study we produced a range of materials that had different degrees of ligand substitution, from none at all, so basically virgin UIO66, all the way through to Azo-100 UIO66. So that is where 100% of the ligands are substituted with our azobenzene functionalized ligand. And this graph shows us basically that our hypothesis was correct, that as we increase the degree of substitution of the ligand, we see an increasing extent of photoresponsive nature. So I've talked quite a lot about photoresponsive porous materials, but actually the core concept of this poster, of this presentation, is can we make mixed matrix membranes that are useful for CO2 and N2 separations using these photoresponsive materials? So just to recap and to make sure we're all on the same page, the fundamental concept of mixed matrix membranes is that you combine two phases, a continuous phase and a discrete phase, and you produce some new composite membrane that has properties that are somewhere between that of the inorganic phase or the discrete phase and the continuous phase, which is often the polymer phase. In reality, we usually see some departure from that weighted average, and it can be a positive departure. You might see some really surprising or new or interesting results where the properties of the composite are quite distinctly different from the two components. For example, maybe you generate a lot of free surface or a lot of free volume at the interface between the phases, and that may produce a highly permeable membrane. For example, there are of course many results which are quite negative as well, where people don't see positive results from mixing two components together. And of course, most of those results are never published. In our work, what we have tried to do is take a continuous phase, so say a polymer membrane that by itself doesn't have any intrinsic photoresponsive nature, and load into that polymer porous materials. So this is a very common thing to do in making composite gas separation membranes, is to take porous particles and put them into, for example, a glassy polymer. And in our case, we've said, well, what would happen if we put photoresponsive porous particles? So particles of a MOF that we know is photoresponsive, that changes its CO2 sorption characteristics when it's illuminated with light. What happens if we put those into a polymer membrane and then test the polymer membrane for gas separation while the polymer membrane is illuminated? And actually, while it's not the topic of this presentation or this poster, there was an interesting bit of engineering work that went into creating a gas permeation cell that allows you to test gas separation through a polymer membrane while you illuminate it with light and at the same time control the temperature of the membrane. We have now shown that we can do that by using an embedded UV light, which is a high-performance LED not far from the membrane surface. And actually right now, here at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, we are developing a new generation of these gas permeation cells where we use an external light source and an optical fiber to bring the light into the cell very close to the membrane surface so that we can illuminate it, but at the same time to minimize localized heating of the membrane. So I hope that perhaps next year, if we have an AIChE annual meeting where we can meet in person, we'll be able to report on our newest generation of gas permeation cell where we can provide in situ illumination of our membranes. So in our work, trying to make these mixed matrix membranes with a photoresponsive nature, we've looked at a range of different photoresponsive particles. And in the first work that we published in this area, we looked at JUC62, and PCN250, and we showed that if you incorporate these into matrimid membranes, you can actually produce genuinely photoresponsive mixed matrix membranes. And in this figure, you see a summary of those results. So for run number 2 and run number 4, we had our light switched on. 1, 3, and 5, it was switched off. And what you see for a controlled polymer membrane, you see no difference. And then for a control mixed matrix membrane, so using a very conventional, very well-known porous particle, ZIF8, we see an increase in the permeability of the membrane, which is a commonly seen property, but no photoresponsive nature. But then when we incorporate our photoresponsive particles, we see that we actually do see a statistically significant, not huge, just a few percent, but genuinely statistically significant decrease in the CO2 permeability when we switch the light on. And remember, when we test these materials as adsorbents, when we switch the light on, they spontaneously desorb some of their adsorbed CO2. So that is consistent. That is what we would expect for these mixed matrix materials, that the inorganic phase does not have such a high sorption capacity for CO2 when it's illuminated with light. And if you apply some standard models of mixed matrix membranes and gas transport through them, this sorption diffusion type model, for example, we would expect in general that a material that adsorbs CO2 less well will transport or permeate CO2 less well. So the mixed matrix transport properties are in keeping with our adsorption properties. So that was very interesting for those materials, but we wanted to see for this study, how does it work with Azo-Uio-66? So in this study, unlike in our previous work where we used matrimid as the continuous phase, we looked for a higher performance material, and in this case we used PIM1. So PIM1 is a polymer of intrinsic microporosity. It was the first one, very, very well known. And of course, since then, many more examples of PIMs have been discovered, developed, and are available. But in this work, we stuck with PIM1. And we produced composite membranes of around 10% loading with Azo-Uio-66 with varying degrees of ligand substitution. And what you see in these SEM images, and there are other SEM images available in the supporting publications as well, is that we were able to produce composite membranes. We were able to disperse the particles to a relatively good extent, although still some agglomeration is visible, and up until 10% at least, we could make membranes that were not too brittle to handle or test for gas permeation properties, in particular in our special gas testing apparatus that has an embedded UV LED. So one perhaps disappointing aspect from this study is that we didn't see the strong or the distinct photo switching result that we observed with the JUC62 and PCN250 in matrimid. So in this particular study we didn't see that. But what we did see is some pleasing enhancements to the separation characteristics of PIM1. And as is very, very well known in this field, these membranes like PIM1 exhibit very distinct aging behavior. And while there has been some fascinating research just in fairly recent times on ways to either stop this aging or to very quickly age the membrane, but then to kind of freeze its properties in some still good state, what we saw is that the PIM1 membranes age and their properties change. But when we incorporated Azo-Uio-66 into PIM1, we could enhance the properties of the membrane, so it moved above the 2008 Robeson upper bound, and that applied for both sort of fresh virgin membranes as well as aged membranes. So a different way to try and present those results is to say, okay, what happens if we look at how the properties of the membrane are enhanced with respect to permeability and with respect to selectivity. So it's very, very important when we're testing the properties of these membranes that as often as possible we test it with mixed gas conditions. So these membranes were all tested for their single gas permeability, so their ideal selectivity was calculated for CO2 and nitrogen, but then they were tested with real mixed gas feed mixtures in this 85:15 proportion and using a GEC to measure the composition of the permeate. And what we see here is that in general, most of the enhancement to the properties of these membranes came from selectivity increases. So the membranes became more selective for CO2 over nitrogen, but in all cases there was some positive increase in the permeability as well. To conclude, we can say that Azo-Uio-66 is a really fascinating photoresponsive MOF. We're very excited to be able to report it, and that it really has this excellent stability, this characteristic of Uio-66, which has seen it studied very, very widely in a massive range of different applications. Very stable, relatively easy to synthesize MOF. Of course, the Azo modification is more complex than just Uio-66, especially preparing the ligand. But in general, it's a relatively straightforward MOF to synthesize. It has the stability and it has photoresponsive nature at room temperature. What we found is that using conventional approaches to mixed matrix membranes, which is that you basically mix the polymer in a solvent with the particles and cast your membrane, we found it fairly difficult to produce a membrane that showed any appreciable photoresponsive nature. And really, it all comes down to the fact that these membranes become brittle. As you increase the proportion of the dispersed phase, the inorganic particles in there, the membrane loses its structural stability. And eventually, when you get to some particular loading, often between 10 and 20% by weight, the membrane just becomes too brittle. You can't handle it anymore. And that's a shame, because actually as we increase the proportion of that inorganic component, that's when we would really expect to see an increase in these interesting photoresponsive properties. So that's where we are at the moment with this work, and that's what's presented in this poster. But what I can tell you is that we are looking for some very exciting and interesting new approaches to producing composite membranes, basically new architectures that move away from this randomized dispersed inorganic phase to try and produce membranes that are not pure inorganic membranes, because actually it's very difficult, for example, with a material like Azo-Uio-66, to get a constant thin coverage of the selective material on a substrate that's robust. So we're trying to not make inorganic membranes, but not make randomly dispersed mixed matrix membranes. We're looking for some smart new architectures where we can basically have a region with a very high concentration of the inorganic material to try and get that very strong responsive nature, but then have a different region of the mixed matrix membrane that gives us the overall structural integrity and good mechanical properties that we have from a polymer membrane. So I hope that we will be able to report more on that in the months and years ahead. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming to visit our poster here at this conference, and we hope to see you in the chat session and of course to continue the discussion in this area.